What's on, guys? Today we are talking about the basics of long exposure, how, when and why you would use it. For those of you who don't know, a long exposure is when a camera's shutter is open for an extended period of time rather than just a really quick blink of an eye that you get just when you're taking a normal photo on your phone or something like that. Firstly, what you'll need is a camera that gives you the ability to manually adjust your shutter speed so you can get that nice slow shutter speed. You then need a nice sturdy tripod, because when the camera shutter is open for an extended period of time, any tiny bits of movement just make your image completely blurry and unusable. So a sturdy tripod is a must. If you can, you want the ability to set manual focus, just because most autofocus systems tend to have a bit of an issue in low light conditions where they can't lock onto something and focus it properly. Finally, the biggest tip when it comes to long exposure is setting a short self timer on your camera, so when you take the picture or push the shutter button to take the photo, you have a couple of seconds to get away from the camera, let the camera settle so it's not moving at all, meaning you get a nice crisp long exposure image. There's loads and loads of applications for long exposure images, but there's kind of three main categories that it falls into. One is the most obvious one, the main one, that is low light, i.e. when it gets dark, because the alternative is cranking up your ISO. COVID. Yeah, so the alternative is cranking up the ISO, which in turn gives a really noisy, grainy image, and in complete darkness like we're in now, obviously you have to go up to like a silly ISO, and even then it probably gets borderline unusable. So having a tripod doing a long exposure allows you to keep your ISO nice and low and getting your exposure by keeping the shutter open for a nice period of time, 15-20 seconds, letting lots and lots of light in, and therefore giving you a nice sharp image, but it's also nice and clear in the low light. The second time is capturing motion. So in a couple of pictures that we've shot earlier, it's capturing the light trails of cars, but it's also really commonly used for things like waterfalls and the sea, giving you that really nice silky water where it's just captured the movement of the water from the top of the waterfall to the bottom, or the waves coming in and out. And again, that can be applied to just about anything, even people walking past, you get nice smooth motion blur. That's all done with long exposure, or a form of long exposure. And the last form, which I'm going to do a whole nother video about, is light painting, which is a very similar principle to the light streaks on a car and things like that, where it's you set a long exposure, then you use a light and you light up your subject in different and creative ways. The long exposure will capture the light over the entire bit as you move the light over, but like I said, there's a new video on that coming very soon, so keep an eye out for that one. So diving a bit deeper into the settings, we use the same principles as normal manual camera settings, which I'm not going to bore you with. There's probably hundreds of thousands of millions of billions of videos on YouTube explaining the basics of aperture, ISO and shutter speed. But what it all boils down to is getting exposure, i.e. getting the image the right brightness, essentially, for you to be able to see what's going on clearly. Normally you would have an aperture to get the look you want, i.e. with the depth of field, ISO as low as possible to prevent the grain in the image. You counter the exposure with the shutter speed. If the image is too bright, you bring the shutter speed up, and that means the shutter goes really quick, letting a smaller amount of light in, and vice versa for a slow shutter speed. And typically, as it gets darker, you can only go so low with the shutter speed before images start getting blurry, because like I said earlier, when the shutter opens and there's a bit of movement, then that movement is picked up by the sensor and transferred into your image. Therefore, the only other option is to crank up your ISO to bring essentially artificial light into the camera itself. The problem you get with ISO is the more horrible noise and grain then comes into your image, and if your ISO is getting too high, then your image just essentially becomes unusable, and you've basically just wasted your time. So what long exposure is leaving your ISO at 100 or whatever the low setting is, and then winding your shutter speed down to 10, 15, 20 seconds, whatever it takes to get the exposure right. And I normally just work off the exposure meter that you have on cameras, just going one stop below, just so it gives you a little bit of room so it doesn't blow car lights and stuff like that out, so they still keep the detail in those as well, and you can bring the shadows up nice and easily in Lightroom or whatever editing software you use. And the great thing about long exposure is if you get yourself a variable ND filter as well, you can actually do a long exposure during the day, and because that's essentially putting sunglasses on, giving you that artificial nighttime, for want of a better phrase. So you're just making the camera darker and then use the shutter speed to brighten it back up again. So you can stare at them and make them feel bad. I really hope that makes sense to you and that I've actually taught you something a little bit new about long exposure. And if you are going to go out there and give long exposure a go, I'd love to see what you come up with. So tag me on Instagram at harry.base and I'll let you know what I think. I really look forward to seeing those. And if you did like this video, then why not hit the like button down below, because that really is appreciated and it really does help. And whilst you're down there, why not hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos just like this one. But until then, I'll see you in the next one. Wait.